Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's DoD Environmental Planning and Conservation webinar series presentation. Today's session is titled Recovering Species, Sustaining Our Mission through the Recovery and Sustainment Partnership Initiative. Today's presenters are Stephanie Hertz, Recovery and Sustainment Partnership Coordinator at the Department of Defense, and Dan Schwarz, Natural Resources Specialist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Today's presentation will be recorded and then posted on the Natural Resources DNX website under Resources. Before we get started, please take a moment to make sure your phones and web browsers are on mute. With that, I will turn it over to Stephanie. Stephanie, I think you're on mute.
Great way to start. Okay, I'm still getting lots of pop-ups of people joining, so thanks for letting me know. So as Dan mentioned, my name is Stephanie Hertz. I'm the Recovery and Sustainment Partnership Coordinator for Department of Defense within the Environmental Planning and Conservation Program. So I'm really excited to be here today with my counterpart at Fish and Wildlife Service and to present this overview on the Recovery and Sustainment Partnership Initiative, or as we like to call it, the RASP. It's a really exciting partnership that showcases how we can use collaborative partnerships to enhance our agency missions while also achieving real-world successes for both military readiness and species conservation. So I really do appreciate the opportunity. So thank you to the DoD Environmental Planning and Conservation Program. And I really appreciate all of your time today as well to be here to learn a little bit more. So today we're going to provide a little bit of a background on the RASP and how the DoD and the Department of the Interior work together. We agree on focal species. We're going to talk about some recent accomplishments for the RASP species, which is always one of my favorite parts in the presentation. And then we'll leave you all with some information on how you can reach out to Dan and myself to find out more information. So with that, I was going to hand things over to Dan, let him introduce himself and get started on the presentation. And then also just to let everybody know, Dan and I think we're going to turn our cameras off for the actual slide presentation just to save bandwidth, but then we will come back on at the end of the presentation for the Q&A. So you will see us again. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dan.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Schwarz. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our headquarters office in Falls Church, Virginia. I'm in our Ecological Services program, namely in our recovery program for threatened and endangered species. So very happy to be here today to talk about this very unique and amazing partnership. But first, let's give a little bit of background. So the military needs flexibility to use its lands to develop and test new technologies and effectively train our armed forces. However, the Department of Defense must conduct these activities while at the same time meeting stewardship responsibilities and sustaining our nation's natural heritage. So to address this dynamic relationship between species needs and national defense, the Department of Defense and the Department of Interior, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the lead agency, established the Recovery and Sustainment Partnership Initiative, aka the RASP, as we like to call it. This partnership was started in 2018, namely to develop and promote species conservation and increase flexibility for military mission activities. So this partnership builds on years of collaboration and innovation under the ESA between the Department of Defense and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This demonstrates how innovative approaches, science and technology, and ecosystem management can achieve real-world successes for both military readiness and species and their habitats. The goals of RASP are to create more flexibility and certainty for the Department of Defense so that they can execute their mission and also improve conservation outcomes for species and their habitats. This is a mutually beneficial partnership which uses the following strategies to achieve those goals. We develop innovative regulatory approaches and tools for achieving the intent of the ESA in a manner consistent with both U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and military mission needs and objectives. We also develop collaborative conservation initiatives to enhance species conservation, advance species recovery, and also preclude the need to list additional species under the ESA. We also recognize and respond to the current and projected impacts of climate change on these ecosystems and watersheds and on species that occur within them. And we also must ensure that we recognize the successes that are achieved under this partnership in support of our conservation goals and targets. Next slide. So this is kind of the general process that occurs under RASP. The first step is we identify a mission priority species under RASP that impacts both DoD's mission, has risk or program costs associated with that species, but where there's also opportunities for conservation success. So once we have identified that priority species or priority geographic area sometimes, we then can go through 3 different approaches. The first approach is to develop a species action plan that defines priority action items and a mutual desired outcomes between Department of Defense and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The second approach is we could develop a collaborative partnership with other stakeholders besides just DoD and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to achieve these conservation initiatives and overall defined outcomes. And then the last and third approach involves the development of innovative regulatory approaches to meet the objectives of the Endangered Species Act, but can also streamline those administrative processes, achieve greater conservation outcomes, and to gain mission flexibilities. Now, irregardless of which approach is chosen under the RASP, all 3 require coordination of resources and expertise, performing research, and also engaging other partners, including federal, state, academia, and private partners. The end goal of all of this effort is to create greater mission flexibility for the Department of Defense, achieving streamlined consultation processes, all the while we're enhancing conservation outcomes for our species and their habitats. Next slide. So there's over 1,000 species of potential management concern, either they're threatened, endangered, or at risk, that have been identified by the Department of Defense. The RASP initiative focuses on just over 50 of those species, or approximately 5% of that overall list of species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Defense revisit that priority list of species periodically to adapt our approaches that we're taking with those species, and also due to mission concerns. The species needs and partnerships opportunities are unique, requiring multiple tools in the toolbox to create innovative solutions. And you could use the QR code on this slide to see the full list of priority species. Next slide. So under the RASP, there are currently 11 species action plans that have been completed, providing enhanced focus, collaboration, and benefits to over 15 different species. These species action plans have a spectrum of different outcomes depending on the mission, the species status, and the needs of that species. The desired outcomes may include improved conservation status, regulatory flexibility, or even changing the listing under the Endangered Species Act due to advancing recovery of that species. Next slide. We have 3 additional species action plans that are in development. These SAPs have been put on a strategic pause until other priority efforts have been completed. Between our completed SAPs and these under development, 20 species will have received enhanced focus and collaboration under the RASP, addressing challenges and conservation priorities at many installations and ranges across the country. I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And I think so far the bandwidth is going okay. So put the cameras back on and we'll see how it goes. So now DoD and Fish and Wildlife Service, we are working together to explore new approaches to the Endangered Species Act to ensure that DoD can meet its training and testing requirements, but also contribute to the conservation of species on its installations. So we have hearing a little bit of feedback. If people could just make sure they're muted. Thanks. So we have 2 pilot projects underway. One is in the Northwest U.S. and another one is in the Southeast. And through these pilot projects, DoD, Fish and Wildlife Service are working together to develop solutions for conservation challenges of today and the future, to really ensure that DoD can meet its national defense mission. And I'll go into the pilot projects in a little bit more detail. The pilot project in the Northwest is at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and at that pilot project, we're establishing some defined conservation goals that would allow for broad training and management flexibility for the installation. And so using this approach, the installation would receive flexibilities for mission along with relief from training restrictions as they meet defined conservation goals for species. And then we have the second pilot project in the Southeast underway at Fort Moore within the Georgia Sentinel landscape, looking at ecosystem management approaches that benefit multiple species. So we're piloting a conservation commitment there that's going to use the installation's integrated natural resource management plan to improve and sustain habitat conditions and species while also fulfilling the ESA requirements. So really feel like by committing to long-term conservation goals, installations are going to gain more flexibility to fulfill their missions. We're going to have a more established and predictable, streamlined process to implement the Endangered Species Act and also improve species outcomes along the way. And when we're done with the pilot projects, we're going to evaluate our successes and develop some lessons learned from the process and the concepts and the approaches. And then we're going to use this after action review to inform future projects to help us refine and advance these novel approaches through the renewed MOU that we have for the RASP. And then perhaps develop some policy and guidance as well that's going to help us successfully implement concepts at other DoD installations and ranges that are dealing with conservation challenges. Next, I wanted to talk about nationwide strategies. And so through the RASP, we are working on some nationwide conservation strategies for several species, to include bats and monarchs, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. You might be asking yourself why DoD Fish and Wildlife Service are looking at nationwide strategies, and really it's to provide consistent strategic approach to help our installation natural resource managers for species that are wide-ranging and are impacting numerous installations or have the potential to impact multiple installations due to regulatory requirements. And so for these nationwide strategies, we have some goals that we're looking to achieve. One is we want to develop an improved Section 7 process for the wide-ranging species that's going to result in efficient and predictable ESA consultation coverage for all applicable DoD installations. We want to identify some best management practices that are going to contribute to the conservation of these species, but are also going to streamline consultations and minimize potential mission restrictions due to ESA compliance. Of course, we want to make sure we're improving the conservation status of the species. And we also want to have some recommendations developed on standards and protocols for inventory and monitoring and data and storage. So we're all collecting information in the same way so we can use that data to really inform decisions. Next, under the RASP umbrella, I wanted to talk about collaborative initiatives. Okay, I think bandwidth cut out a little bit. Can people still hear me?
You're back now.
Okay, woo. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so collaborative initiatives, what we were talking about. So this is under the RASP umbrella. This is another way that we work together with other partners to conserve species, help them reach recovery, or conserve species before they need to be listed under the ESA. So through these partnerships, we work on strategies, we coordinate our resources and expertise to implement collaborative species conservation. And so we really feel like we're being most effective when we focus our conservation actions and resources across ecosystems and landscapes. And that's going to extend species and habitat benefits, not just on installations, but in the spaces between the bases. So that's going to result in greater conservation outcomes. And DoD and DOI, we have collaborated and achieved a lot of successes over the years through a lot of different initiatives. I thought I would highlight just a few in this presentation. So one great example is the Collaborative Wildlife Protection Recovery Initiative. So this is an informal voluntary partnership of government and non-governmental agencies, and it's specifically focused on recovering endangered species or precluding the need to list additional species under the ESA while also achieving regulatory process efficiencies. So we have a proof of concept underway for the least bills vireo, and we've been using this proof of concept to really demonstrate how we can be more effective with our conservation actions and achieve greater outcomes by working together rather than working in silos. And so that particular partnership is actually looking for additional geographies and other species to collaborate into the future. Another partnership that we really like to tout under the RASP, here we go. This is the Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. So this is a DoD subject matter expert network, and it was established before the RASP, but it's one that the RASP leans on a lot because they provide leadership and guidance and support for the conservation and management of amphibians and reptiles on DoD lands in a way that considers and really helps sustain the military's testing and training and operational missions. And they're really a great model for collaboration where it allows partners to work together, and it really provides that vehicle to bring in additional expertise and help us, work with partners in a way that we're going to be able to do the best that we can for the species. And they've actually developed a list of mission sensitive species. And we actually use this as part of our RASP priority species. They have a top 10 list of species that are not currently listed, but if they would become listed under the Endangered Species Act, could create some constraints for the military mission. And so the RASP uses these mission sensitive species to we focus on these species as well, just based on this input from DoD Park. So this is a really great collaboration that we feel like is very, very effective. So the next partnership I wanted to mention is a third model of effective collaboration. Again, this one was also around before RASP, but it's one that we really lean on quite a bit, and we like to highlight it as a model, but it's the DoD Partners in Flight. So they also help to sustain and enhance the military mission. They look at proactive habitat-based conservation and management strategies for birds. They were established back in 1991, and they look and work with partners collaboratively across the Americas to conserve migratory and resident birds in their habitats. So they also have a mission sensitive species list for birds. So again, these are birds that are not listed yet under the Endangered Species Act, but if they do become listed, could create some challenges for the DoD. So we make sure that we focus on these species as well through the RASP. Okay, and then I think this part is Dan.
Thanks, Stephanie. So as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, one of our strategies under RASP is to recognize our successes. And one of the most recent successes we have is the recent downlisting of the red cockaded woodpecker. So this species has been listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act for more than 50 years. This RASP mission priority species relies on mature longleaf pine forests and its habitats, which has largely dwindled across the nation. However, large swaths of longleaf pines are still intact on military lands, and especially in the southeastern United States. So in October of this past year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our partners celebrated a huge step in the recovery of the species by reclassifying it under the Endangered Species Act from endangered to threatened. So by performing this action, it acknowledged not only the improvement in the bird's status, but the intense work of multiple partners across the range of the species in order to move the needle of conservation. So while the success of the red cockaded woodpecker represents years of conservation work by federal agencies, state agencies, tribes, and the private sector, the RASP was able to support these existing efforts by enhancing the collaboration that already existed, supporting the information gathering to assess the status of the species, documenting management and monitoring activities on the military installations themselves, and then carry out other priority action items that further the conservation of this species. Next slide. And another recent success that Stephanie mentioned earlier in the presentation is on the monarch butterfly. So again, the species was identified as one that have a nationwide strategy under the RASP, because the monarch butterfly has experienced range-wide declines and has been recently proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act just last week. So given the monarch's occurrence in a wide variety of habitats across the United States, this potential listing under the Endangered Species Act could result into some impacts for the Department of Defense and the military readiness. So the Department of Defense has worked on monarch conservation for over a decade and has the unique authorities and strong conservation programs that promote ecosystem resilience across this wide range of land, almost across 24 million acres. The Department of Defense's longstanding commitment has resulted in significant contributions to conservation for the monarch and, of course, for other at-risk pollinators. But in the pursuit of a proactive and innovative approach to conserve the monarch butterfly while simultaneously meeting the Endangered Species Act consultation and mission requirements, the Department of Defense and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agreed to work together under the RASP by making monarch a RASP priority species. As a result of doing this, the Department of Defense and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service collaboratively developed a conservation strategy and a conference opinion that underscores DoD's commitment to the monarch butterfly conservation, yet enables DoD to meet its mission with the flexibility and certainty that they need. Senior leaders from the Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Defense recently celebrated the completion of this strategy at Camp Pendleton in California on December 12th last week. Back to you, Stephanie.
Hi. Yeah, so now we've gotten to the part of the presentation that is my favorite, as I mentioned earlier. So Dan mentioned some of the accomplishments for some of our RAS species that occurred in 2024, which is really exciting. But we also had some really exciting things that happened in 2023 as well. And so just wanted to continue to highlight those. So in 2023, actually between 1973, I'll give a little background here, between 1973 and 2022, 54 species have been delisted due to recovery since the creation of the Endangered Species Act. But then in 2023, we had 6 species that were delisted due to conservation efforts by DoD and its partners. And so that represents 10% of all delistings due to recovery and DoD's continued commitment to species protection while enhancing the military mission. So that was something that we were very excited about. And just to dive into that a little further, 5 of the species, so in January 2023, 5 species that were previously on the brink of extinction were declared recovered by the Fish and Wildlife Service, thanks to a lot of years of hard work from the U.S. Navy. And then similarly, in July 2023, we had the delisting of the Okaloosa darter due to recovery, thanks to Eglin Air Force Base and all the partners working there as well. So those were announcements that we were very excited. And again, it's not delistings that happen because of the RAS. It's because of a lot of years of these partners working together. And, you know, it's just something that we were very excited to celebrate and hope that the RAS was able to provide some additional help towards the end there and to get those across the finish line. So a couple of additional accomplishments wanted to highlight for you all. So in addition to some of the delisting successes of RAS species in 2023 and then the downlisting of the RCW in 2024, Fish and Wildlife Service has also downlisted the Hawaiian goose, the American burying beetle, Stevens kangaroo rat, and also delisted the lesser long-nosed bat and the black cat vireo. Some other things that I think are great to highlight are the fact that through the RASP, Fish and Wildlife Service, the DoD, and Bureau of Land Management, along with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, developed an implementation strategy for a 7A1 program, basically a proactive conservation program for the Mojave Desert tortoise. We've also been able to support some really important research and monitoring studies that were really important for advancing the knowledge that we have in these species for the golden cheek warbler, the Guam orchid, the eastern indigo snake, the marbled murrelet, the Inyo California towhee, and also the Okaloosa darter. We've also been able to support capacity within the Fish and Wildlife Service Pacific Islands Fish and Wildlife Office to work on comprehensive conservation strategies for at-risk and threatened endangered species in the region. And so that just kind of gives you a flavor of the many things that we work on through the RASP, and it can really look many different ways, from species action plans to species, status changes, 7A1 strategies. So we really try to find different ways to tackle our challenges, but work together to ensure that we're increasing flexibility for the military mission, but also achieving great outcomes for species at the same time. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. So, hopefully this was a helpful overview. We are definitely excited to hear any questions that you all have. I do want to just let you guys know that we have some QR codes here on the slide. One of them will take you to our RASP website, and another one will take you to a new RASP fact sheet that was developed this year. So that's a really great resource if you just want to get some general information about the RASP. You've also got contact information for myself and Dan. So if you think of any questions afterwards, would like to reach out to us, we're always happy to, answer any questions that you might have. So with that, Dan, do you think we're ready to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar?
I think so.
Thank you, Stephanie and Dan, for that excellent presentation. We will now begin the Q&A portion of this webinar. Participants may use the raise hand function and wait to be called on before unmuting and asking their question, or participants may submit their questions to the chat. Our first question comes from Sherry. Sherry asks, regarding coordination, so far all of the coordination has been at DoD MCHQ level. When will the installation experts be coordinated with?
So is there a specific species you are asking about, Sherry? Oh, the pond turtle. With the pond turtle, we don't have a species action plan for that particular species. It is one of the species that we have developed. When I say we, I should say the DoD Park has developed some best management practices for Western pond turtle, and those have been incorporated incorporated into the integrated natural resource management plans. And so we've really been using more of our partnerships on that particular species. And I think Rob is on the line as well. I don't know if he has any particular responses for that one, but for pond turtle, that would be my response there.
Our next question is from Rob. Rob asks, Royo toad was originally on the RASP list, but taken off, I believe. What is the status of that species for RASP?
So we did have a lot of species that we originally considered. And I think it just comes down to, we had to do things in batches. So we didn't have enough capacity to be able to tackle all of the species that we wanted to collaborate on. So we kind of had to start in batches. And so one of the things that we're planning to do in 2025 is take a look at the species that are currently on the list, and then take a look at those that either have been brought to us as ideas of species that really could benefit from some sort of enhanced collaboration, or are species that we looked at previously but had not been able to get to yet. And so that would be part of that, 2025 review that we're going to do, is looking at some of those previous species that we couldn't get to yet because of all the species that we were trying to focus on in a very short period of time. Dan, do you have another response to that?
Yeah, I just kind of echo what you said. And just because a RASP, a species doesn't get on a RASP list doesn't mean that we aren't coordinating amongst ourselves at different levels, at the installation field office level or even regional office levels, to work on those species. It's just, as Stephanie mentioned, there's only so many species we can elevate to a level and include in RASP.
Our next question is from Cynthia. Cynthia asks, is there an effort for DoD to support conservation outside military lands, though providing funds? I remember hearing discussion about this because, in general, species are doing better on DoD lands versus other public lands.
I think that would fall, my first response would be that would kind of fall within the Sentinel Landscapes program, which is a program that we work very closely with. So Sentinel Landscapes, these are landscapes surrounding military installations that also have working lands, have an agriculture component, have a natural resources component that, is beneficial to species. And we do have designations across the country where they really do focus on those off-base lands. So we work very closely with the Center Landscapes Partnership, but there certainly are situations where there could be some off-base needs that has a tie to our RAS priority species, and we just have to look at those on a case-by-case basis. Dan, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that we do oftentimes have to initiate the work and develop kind of either a species action plan, or even, as we mentioned, we would establish a collaborative partnership with other state, federal agencies. Sentinel Landscapes is way that we include private landowners, but if we need to bring in NRCS, we can do that. The RASP kind of is like the planning phase of what do we need to accomplish for the conservation of the species and for the installations. And then as far as like the implementation of the actions and getting funds, then we can go beyond just that initial planning effort and bring in other partners when needed.
Our next question is from Bob. Bob asks, is Fish and Wildlife, or DOI, considering RASP-like partnerships with other federal land managing agencies such as BLM and USFS?
Most definitely. We are trying to use this example between DOI and DOD with other federal agencies. We are working on similar efforts that you could caveat as RASP-like, of doing proactive conservation ahead of time before consultation process start. So yes, we are promoting this partnership to other federal agencies, and we do have existing partnerships with other federal agencies that take on some of the similar flavor of the work that we're doing under this one.
Our next question is a raised hand from Michael. Michael, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Sure can.
Yep.
I was wondering if you're aware of the Avian Knowledge Network and how most, all DoD installations are supposed to upload all their bird surveys on that network, and what that would mean for listed and threatened species and species of concern on these installations. Do you work with AKN, or are you interested in working with AKN? I do a lot of work with AKN here at ERDC, and is there an opportunity to coordinate this effort more broadly on these installations nationwide?
That's a great question. And actually, I was just talking to somebody that works with AKN as well a couple of days ago. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the best things would be for, our mission sensitive, our mission priority avian species. The hope is that everybody's using standard protocols and they're all entering their data into AKN, so we can make sure that we're collecting data in the same way and that we can assess trends over time. And I think that there's also Fish and Wildlife Service. Dan, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but Fish and Wildlife Service, I believe, also puts data into AKN, or maybe some of the refuges and things like that. But I definitely think it's a great thing, and it's something that DoD supports and wants all of its installations to be putting their data into. So I think it's definitely gets at one of the goals for the RASP is, having consistent, good data so we can make good management decisions.
All right, thank you.
Our next question is from Valerie. Valerie asks, can you provide an example or link of a streamlining process you've developed for efficient consultation, i.e. decision support tools or something similar?
So I would say the streamlined consultations that we have been working towards with our pilot projects, we don't have biological opinions completed for those yet. So I don't think we would be able to share that quite yet, but hopefully in the near future, when those pilots wrap up, we could have hoping to have some fact sheets out there that we could share. I believe some of the work that we've been doing with Fish and Wildlife Service on the Monarch, some of those are going to be posted as well, and that gets at some of the nationwide, 7A1 strategies and, conference opinion as well. I think those are going to be made available on the DoD DENIX website. And I think Fish and Wildlife Service is going to make the conference opinion available as well on their website. So I think that's what I would recommend.
And as far as like the bat work also that we're working on, we're planning to have determination keys developed for that effort as well. So a lot more coming soon.
Our next question is from Karen. Karen asks, regarding the eastern fritillary butterfly in Pennsylvania, the butterfly is protected in Indiantown Gap area, which is also located in the designated Kittatinny Ridge Sentinel Landscape. Regarding collaboration, will there be an outreach to the regional planning commissions or state parks to try to extend, to plan or extend conservation areas, especially with the presence of monarchs in the spring and summertime?
Amber, do you know the answer to that question? I know you are very involved with Sentinel Landscapes Federal Coordinating Committee.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer that specifically. I know they are trying to continue to expand that CCA that was originally developed before listing into a CBA, but I do not have the specifics on that effort, but I can reach out to our POC to get back to you, Karen.
Our next question is from Bob. Bob asks, can you provide some specifics on the improvements in the ESA Section 7 consultation process? Will those improvements be generalized to consultations involving other federal species?
I think I would make a similar response to the question that I answered a little bit earlier, but I think with the Conservation Policy Initiative, when those biological opinions are complete, and we're hoping that they will be complete, hopefully, in the next few months or early this year, we're going to do sort of an after action review to take a look at, how consultations have been done traditionally, and how we were able to streamline that process, what that looks like, and how somebody, if they wanted to, replicate that kind of process, they would be able to do something similar. And so we want to develop some communications materials and kind of roll that out. But I think, waiting until those biological opinions are completed would be the right way to go. But I will say there is actually, I'm just not thinking about this. The Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute developed this communications product called this ESA Toolbox. And in there, they showcase different case studies from around the country, different military installations, and it's sort of designed to be a tool where installation natural resource management managers could look at examples of where installations have been able to streamline their consultations, achieve better conservation results for species, and see if any of those might fit their conservation needs as well. And that is something that has been is actually available online, I believe, and it's something that's going to be showcased at the upcoming National Military Fish and Wildlife Association meeting. And so that might be a great place to look as well. It doesn't talk specifically about the Conservation Policy Initiative pilot projects, since we're still waiting to complete those, but it does showcase some really great examples that have been done at DoD installations across the country. And that would be something you could look at now. So that's one thing I didn't mention before, but I'm realizing now would be a good thing for people to take a look at if they were interested in seeing what has worked well and where.
I'll just add to that a little bit and say that recently we've been promoting the use of 7A1 tools for our federal agencies. DoD has been a leader in that effort, and the one example that Stephanie mentioned earlier was the Mojave Desert Tortoise 7A1 program, which they were able to then use to inform their consultation and able to get the mission needs that the installation needed. So that's another tool that we've been promoting for federal agencies to use proactively, and then they were able to go through the consultation process a lot more seamlessly.
Our next question is from Aaron. Aaron asks, is there a timeline when the Sonoran Pronghorn SAP effort will be re-engaged and finalized?
That's on that's one of our species that is on the list to look at in early 2025. Yeah. Dan, anything to add to that?
No, it's one we're hoping to get back on in the new year, but there is not currently a targeted timeline.
Our next question is from Brady. Brady asks, when might we expect the complete conservation strategy for monarch that was celebrated last week to be released to the installations? Impacts to migrating and breeding habitat and potential consultations will need to get started ASAP for many of us if they will be required for maintaining our existing ranges, rights of ways, etc. on our installations.
So my response to that would be, there will be a guidance memo coming out. The plan is for a memo to come out from the OSD level that would go out and be filtered down to the installations that would provide a copy of the conference opinion and the 7A1 DoD strategy. It would kind of outline, what that means for installations, and then would outline some additional steps that we plan to take over the coming year to transform that into full Section 7 consultation for installations for mission and mission sustainment activities. So there still are some things that we need to figure out to make implementation as easy as possible for the installation. So we do plan to issue a memo that's going to provide a little bit more guidance and be able to give you guys some expectations of what to expect next. So that will hopefully go out in January.
Our next question is from Bob. Bob asks, which specific statutory authorities that DoD has to enable species conservation, both on and off military lands, should be extended by Congress to other federal land managing agencies in order to enable and empower similar partnerships with other federal agencies?
I'd have to think about that question. Does anything come to mind for you, Dan, right off the bat?
No, I mean, I'm thinking that there are already existing authorities. This just for those federal agencies to use those existing authorities through funding mechanisms that can go to additional partners to then implement planning efforts that can be developed internally with each federal agency. So I'm not sure if there are specific authorities that DoD has that other federal agencies don't have, some of the ones that they can implement off their federally owned or managed lands. It's usually the mechanisms are in place through other means. It's just having the coordination and the planning occurring at the federal agency level first.
As a reminder, participants may use the raise hand function and wait to be called on before unmuting and asking their question, or participants may submit their questions to the chat. While folks wait for the next question, if I may ask one of my own, what has been the most surprising success of the RASP since it was started?
Trying to think of an answer to that. I mean, I think a lot of these successes were things that we were working towards. So we're always very happy when they happen, but I don't know that they happen as a surprise. Each success is special. I mean, the Monarch celebration, that was one that came together, just last week, I believe. And the idea of the celebration wasn't one that I was tracking, but then when we were able to have it out at Camp Pendleton and really we were able to bring some partners that had been working with us on monarch conservation, that made it that much more special, that we had been doing all this work between Fish and Wildlife Service and DoD to develop the strategy, and then also working with partners that were coming out to DoD installations and helping us understand what we have on our lands and where we have monarch habitat. So it felt very collaborative. So maybe, that's a very recent success, but I would say the celebration wasn't necessarily one that I was tracking a while ago, but when we had it, I was really, really glad that we did. Dan, anything come to mind for you?
No, I wouldn't really speak to any one individual success because there are so many. I would just say the success of the partnership overall at all levels within the Department of Defense and Interior, all the way down to our local installations and field office level folks. As we mentioned, the RASP initiative is fairly new, but there has been a long, extending partnership between the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Defense to work together on conservation issues. And one thing that the RASP has been able to do is to elevate when there are potential issues that come up at the local level, so that we're able to resolve those efficiently and as quickly as we can to develop win-win solutions for the installation and for the species and their habitat. So just really the overall being able to quickly move issues from a local level up to a higher level, that we get resources where they're needed when that happens, has kind of been the largest overall success I've seen with the partnership.
Our next question is from Sherry. Sherry asks, what does the RASP do other than act as an umbrella for other partnerships?
It is an umbrella for other partnerships, but it's able to bring attention and focus on species in a way that I think is very unique at the headquarters level, and also all the way up to the assistant secretary level. And I think that sometimes with some of these species and the good work that's happening on the ground, being able to highlight that good work or those needs for the species and what is needed to move the needle. Sometimes you do need, headquarters and higher leadership attention to be able to get the resources you need to advance conservation. So I think that's what makes it kind of unique. It's just being able to bring that attention and focus to great work that's happening, but maybe we just need to be able to do a little bit more, and having that attention helps us do that.
I would say, kind of going on your point about, we only have limited amount of funds, right? So one of the things that we try to do is identify these priority species or priority geographic areas where we have a mutually, mutual priorities that we need to work on, and we don't want to work on them individually. We don't work on them together with a large group of partners. So that way we can all achieve our individual missions, but do it collectively to hopefully be more strategic with the funds that we do have.
Yeah. Anyone has any further questions, participants may use the raise hand function and wait to be called on, or participants may submit their questions to the chat.
And I am just seeing in the chat that some people are posting links to that ESA toolbox that I talked about that provides those case studies for some very successful ESA consultations that were done for different military installations. So thank y'all for putting that in the chat, because I was thinking to myself, okay, how do I get that out to people? So take a look at the chat, and that resource is there.
Well, if there are no further questions, Stephanie and Dan, do you have any final thoughts you would like to share with the group?
I think I would just close with appreciation for you guys all being here and asking these questions. We don't get a lot of opportunities, Dan and myself, to really, showcase the RASP to so many people. And I know it's getting close to the holidays. So just the fact that you guys are jumping on this phone call with us, getting close to the middle to late part of December, we really appreciate it. And hearing your questions too is really helpful, because that makes us think about, okay, people are asking questions on this particular topic. We need to make sure that we address that in our communications. We do plan on doing a refresh, like I said, in early January 2025. We'll be updating the website, working on some other communications material. So I'm really looking forward to things, RASP related things early next year, and just hearing your questions help us be even better at communicating what we're trying to achieve. And so just thank you guys so much. And please don't hesitate if you think of other questions, reaching out to Dan and myself. We always like talking about RASP. So, would welcome any kind of outreach. So thank you all. Dan?
No, just ditto the thanks and appreciation. I hope everyone has a great holiday.
I think there is one question from Tad. Tad, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just trying to give you a thumbs up. I hit the wrong button.
Gotcha.
Okay.
We'll take it.
Thanks, Tad.
Thank you, Stephanie and Dan, for sharing your insights and experiences with the group today. This concludes today's presentation. A recording of this session will be posted on the Natural Resources DNX website under Resources. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Great job, you two.